by Katie Rosa. And the purpose of this is just so the student can get a little practice presenting in front of a group of people and have some people besides the committee members look at it and see if they come up with any good ideas on how the project might be improved. So without further ado, Katie will talk about 20 minutes and we'll have time for questions.
Thank you all for being here today. I will be proposing the research 100 years of vegetation succession in the Eastern Glacial Foreland on Mount Baker, which is pictured here. And before I begin, just want to acknowledge and thank my committee, Dr. Rock, Lula Flower, and Rebecca Fong. Thank you. So my research is within the context of climate change and glacier retreat. So glaciers are important indicators of climate change because they provide visible evidence of changes in temperature and precipitation. And glaciers around the world have been shrinking since the 1970s, as shown in this graph here. So this graph shows the average net mass balance of 37 glaciers that have been monitored consistently since the 1970s. And so there's an obvious negative trend in the mass balance, indicating a loss of snow and ice. And so when these glaciers melt and retreat, they expose new land in the area in front of the glacier terminus. And this is newly exposed terrain that's available for the development of soils and vegetation. So you can see in these photos, these are massive landscape changes that are occurring relatively quickly over relatively short periods of time. So it will become increasingly important to understand these landscapes as the climate continues to form. And so these landscape changes are also occurring right here in our backyard. So my study site is the Eastern Glacial Foreland, which is on Mount Baker. And Mount Baker is the tallest stratovolcano in the North Cascades. And it's highly glaciated with about 12 significant glaciers. And from 1990 to 2010, these glaciers also experienced negative loss in their total volume, about 12 to 20%, depending on the specific glacier. But the Eastern Glacier is one that has retreated significantly since the 1990s. And this photo here is showing the change over a 100-year time scale. So the photo up above is the photo from 1912 showing the Eastern Glacier filling in the valley. And then in 2012, you can see the glacier has retreated significantly, and that's an area of about 2 kilometers in length. So this newly exposed land here is my study site. And it's also important to note that the Eastern Glacier did advance from 1956 to 1990, but it has been consistently retreating since 1990. And the Eastern Glacial Foreland is a unique landscape. I am following the footsteps of a study that was done by Wallen in 2013 under the advisement of Dr. Bach. And he was looking at indicators of soil development within this foreland. And they found that this Cascadian system develops much more rapidly than compared to others that have been studied around the world. And this is most notably found in their findings of 12% increase of organic matter over the 100-year time span. So that's a significant amount of formation over a relatively short period of time. And they also found that the best indicator of soil development was vegetation. So this creates a great opportunity for me to come in and study the vegetation in greater detail to continue telling the story of the Eastern Foreland. So my specific research seeks to describe the stages of primary succession and to examine the relationships between microsite environmental variables and successional stages. So I'll continue to break that down as we go through. But my research approach will be to apply the geoecological framework, and this is an extension of the chronosequence framework. So the chronosequence approach is understood that the vegetation changes that are found with increasing distance from the glacier terminus is represented in a time sequence. So essentially you're substituting space for time from the glacier terminus to wherever you designate as the end. And within that valley is a time sequence of vegetation succession. But this, so this has been applied historically in vegetation studies in glacial forelands, and the most foundational work was done by Cooper in 1923 in Glacier Bay, Alaska, which one of the glaciers is pictured there. So this is a traditional method, but it is limited because it assumes environmental factors other than time are consistent or controlled. And so a relatively recent approach, a geoecological approach, which was presented in the late 90s, assumes that biological and physical systems interact within the glacial foreland. So this approach requires a holistic investigation into the various factors that are influencing the vegetation in a glacial foreland. But it also uses the space for time substitution to create the time scale throughout the valley. So, using the geoecological principles, my research questions are: what plant species exist? How do plant cover, richness, and diversity change throughout succession? And how are these changes in vegetation related to my environmental variables, which are terrain age, elevation, aspect, photosynthetic active radiation, and soil moisture? So this map is showing my study area, and the specific study sites are the yellow dots throughout the valley. And there are 65 sites where I'll collect my data over 1 to 2 days in just a couple of weeks. I do have a team of undergraduates who will be going out there with me. And so I plan to collect these in a short time period, but we'll see how that goes. But these are the same sites that were used by Wallen in his study of soil development. And they were randomly selected using GIS, and then they are corrected on the ground for flat surfaces, so slope of less than 5%, and also avoid the alluvial influences of the glacial melt that's going through the valley. But so the GPS units we're using have an area of up to 2 meters, so it will be difficult to relocate the exact point that was used in Wallen's study. So I will try to find a site within 2-meter radius of these locations. It's also likely that natural alterations have occurred within this landscape. So that is another factor that might make it difficult to find the exact point. But the main goal is just to have the same number of sites within each terrain age class. And so these terrain age classes were also established by Wallen, and he used historic photographs and historic records to delineate the glacier terminus throughout these years. So unfortunately, it's a pretty coarse timeline, and that's just due to the records that we have available. But having this timeline is sufficient for my study. So at each site, I will lay down this half square meter quadrat. And the first thing that I will do is identify the plants that are rooted within each quadrat. And I'll do this by using the School-Jarrett McKinnon Field Guide, and then also the Hitchcock and Conquest, which is what the U.S. Forest Service uses to identify plants. But if there are any plants that I cannot identify, I will take vertical photographs of it and detailed notes, bring it back to the herbarium in the biology department, try to figure it out from there. So these are the vegetation variables that I will be measuring: plant cover, richness, and diversity. And I chose these variables because I think they will give me a pretty clear overall picture of the succession throughout the valley. So percent cover will be measured by visual estimation. And so this can be very subjective. So I will have the same person taking this measurement in all of the quadrats throughout the valley. Additionally, we'll take vertical photographs of the quadrats so that other researchers can also verify the estimation and make sure we get the same within about 10%. Plant richness will be measured by counting the number of species within each quadrat. And so this will tell me how many different species are growing in the foreland. And then for plant diversity, this will require counting the abundance of species, so counting the number of individuals per species. And this will begin to tell me characteristics of the plant community. And I will also be calculating the Shannon Diversity Index for diversity. So these are my environmental variables, a few of them. As mentioned before, terrain age class is predetermined. And then with elevation, we will measure it with the GPS units. And elevation essentially is a proxy for temperature. So the higher you go in elevation, the cooler the temperature will be. And it's pretty obvious that the vegetation is not growing all the way up the valley. So elevation is still limiting the vegetation. But as climate continues to warm, we may see species shifting higher in elevation. So this will be an interesting variable to keep track of. But I think that terrain age and elevation will be the most limiting factors for vegetation development. Next, we'll be measuring aspect using my magnetic compass. And although the eastern foreland is primarily southwest facing, I anticipate that there will be some microsite variation in aspect. So next, I'll be measuring photosynthetic active radiation, PAR. And this is the fraction of light that's absorbed by plants and transformed into energy and used in photosynthesis. So it's in this spectral range of about 400 to 700 nanometers in wavelength, and it's expressed as micromoles per second per meter squared. So I'll measure this using a light meter provided by Dr. Rebecca Bunn. And this meter averages 60 values per 15 seconds. So that's a pretty good measurement. But this graph here is just showing the range of wavelengths between the visible light that humans see and the light that plants see. So pretty interesting. And the last variable I'll measure is soil moisture using a soil moisture sensor. And it has a probe of 5 inches. And so I will also be taking about 10 measurements with this and then averaging those within each quadrat. But this is also could be limited due to rain events. So in order to control for that as best as I can, I'll try to go out in clear weather and also just take note of rain events that may happen before we go out. And additionally, I will be returning back to the Easton at the end of the summer to reshape these soil moisture measurements in order to get a composite of the whole summer moisture. Because I'm sure it'll be drier towards the end of the summer. So once I have all my data, I'll be running statistical analysis. So prior to running these correlation tests, I'll test for normality and difference of means. And then I'll run these correlation tests to evaluate the strength and direction of a relationship between my independent and dependent variables. So my independent variables are the environmental variables, and dependent variables are the vegetation variables. So I'll use Spearman's rank correlation for my categorical data, so H class is an aspect, and Pearson's rank for my continuous data of elevation, PAR, and soil moisture. And so the results from the correlation will be graphs like this. This is an example from Wallen's study showing the relationship between elevation and percent vegetation cover. So this graph shows that as elevation increases, percent cover decreases. And so I plan to do this for each combination of my independent and dependent variables. Next, I will run multiple regression models. This is to determine which environmental variable is the strongest predictor of the vegetation variables. So this multiple regression allows me to take into account not just a single independent variable, but multiple independent variables. And so the output of this will be the coefficient of determination, R squared. The closer R squared is to 1, the stronger the model and the stronger the prediction. So this will allow me to explain the impact of changes and predict the trend of species richness or species diversity or cover based on my environmental variables. And lastly, I plan to perform ordination tests. And ordination is used to order multivariate data, and this essentially simplifies the data into ordination space, which clearly illustrates patterns in the data. And specifically, I plan to perform non-metric multidimensional scaling. And so this can be used to summarize species composition and will tell me patterns within the community structure. So basically, the goal of non-metric multidimensional scaling is to end up with a plot like this, where the points that are close together are more similar to each other, and the points that are farther apart are different from each other. So the example here is from a study that was looking at, that used multivariate techniques to look at the influences of environmental factors on different plant assemblages, so grassland, woodland, and shrublands. And so this is ordination with the overlay of the environmental characteristics. And so basically what this is showing, so up here we have these triangles, so this grassland. So this grassland exists in areas where there's higher elevation, higher summer evapotranspiration, and higher annual precipitation. And we can also tell from this that this grassland exists in areas where there's low pH and low silt, and low clay, for example. So I plan to create one of these with my data. I might need to break it up into terrain age classes. I don't have so much data because it's kind of overwhelming. But this will allow me to see all the species and the environmental variables in one space, and I can begin to take out the patterns of the species within the community from this. So in addition to this ordination, I plan to produce a descriptive table like this one here of all the species that I found in each age class. So this is an example from a study very similar to mine that was done in the Coleman Glacier foreland on Mount Baker, which is on the northern side. And so I'll be comparing my findings to their findings, but I plan to make a table like that. And then for predictions, I think, like I said before, terrain age and elevation will have the greatest impact on development of vegetation. And I also predict that there will be rapid development of vegetation relative to other glacier forelands around the world. So in conclusion, this research will contribute to the understandings of vegetation, development, and use of foreland amidst changing climate. So thank you. So now we'll open it up to questions or suggestions.